Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is out now for PlayStation 5, and the PC release is already on the way, just a few weeks out at this point. Before we got Final Fantasy VII Remake on PC, we got DLC for the base game and an upgraded PS5 version in the form of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. Nomura claimed that this title, Intergrade, meant middle, acting as the crossing point between Remake and Part 2 of the trilogy, which we now know is titled Rebirth. Remake eventually made its way to Epic Games Store with all the DLC content in Intergrade in December 2021, just 6 months after the release of Intergrade on PS5. 6 months after that, in June 2022, the port made its way to PC via Steam. So, is there any hope for additional content or DLC for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PC since the game is already almost out on the platform? Welcome to 2025, and let's kick this year off right discussing the DLC situation for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Alrighty, let's get into it. As we know, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth launched on February 29th, 2024, and there wasn't much mention of any additional story content overall. There was, however, one instance of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth DLC in an interview with Tetsuya Nomura from Vandal in September 2023, where he stated that as of then, there were no plans for DLC for Rebirth. In the months that followed Rebirth's release, Yoshinori Kitase and Naoki Hamaguchi sat down for countless interviews, mainly focusing on Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 and the potential challenges the two face with implementing the Highwind. Now, we're gonna jump to November 2024, just before Thanksgiving. Hamaguchi participated in an interview with outlet Daily Star of the United Kingdom, and he revealed something very interesting. He hard confirmed that Rebirth would not have any DLC solely as the team was focused on Part 3. In particular, Hamaguchi said the following: "We definitely do hear the desire from fans, the voices out there that want this kind of thing. I understand it completely, but I think, from my perspective, what the fans really want to see the most is not necessarily DLC. They want to see the third part of the series as quickly as possible. So that's why we've decided not to focus the development resources on creating additional extra episodes for DLC at the moment. We really are putting all our efforts into getting the third game out as quickly as we can. So for the moment, that's where we're focusing our time." This is an answer that I think the majority of the fan base, myself included, were really happy with. Obviously, that final chapter is looming on the horizon, and DLC would only add time before we would get it. Sure, DLC could be really cool, but getting Part 3 sooner than 4 years or so would be even better. As you may know, we know that Final Fantasy VII Remake received DLC in the form of episode Intermission. This DLC was cited to have taken 1 year to develop, leaving Rebirth 3 years of development time. If this timeline is followed for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, we could be looking at getting that third title in the trilogy sometime in 2027. Maybe it's just me, but that's a lot better than getting it in 2028. Obviously though, that was November, and we're in January 2025 now. And if you've been paying attention to either Under the Plate, Twitter, or the news in general, a lot has happened for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. As you may know, the game was revealed to be coming to PC at the Game Awards 2024, conveniently right after our episode on what is going on with the PC release. This port on PC is set to release in just a few weeks on January 23rd. Naturally, this announcement came with plenty of new interviews with both Yoshinori Kitase and Naoki Hamaguchi. Of these, there was a very interesting question and answer from Hamaguchi regarding additional story content for Rebirth on PC. In an interview with the Epic Games Store, Hamaguchi was asked if they had any plans for new content for the PC release. In his response, he stated, We did have the desire to add an episodic story as a new DLC to the PC version, but with limited resources, Hamaguchi decided that finishing the final game in the project as quickly as possible was the highest priority. He continued, stating, "However, if we receive strong requests from players after the release regarding certain matters, we would like to consider them." To summarize this, essentially Hamaguchi confirmed that they were looking to add some sort of DLC to the PC release, but they ended up deciding to focus on Part 3 because they want that game to come out as quickly as possible. The most interesting part of this though, his last statement, where he said if players have demand for it, they will absolutely consider it. So, although DLC for Rebirth is out of the cards for now, it still is possible, technically. And that leaves us with the question, what could Rebirth DLC look like? In my opinion, it's pretty hard to believe that the development team would pivot from the formula we saw for Intermission. Obviously, there's a main story to be told in Part 3. They're not going to do it here. We're not going to get a DLC of, hey guys, let's go to the Icicle Inn or let's go to Rocket Town. No, that's going to get saved for Part 3, as it should be. However, there are lots of possibilities when you start to look at things that could have happened in the past with certain characters, as we saw in Intermission with Yuffie. There are so many different character moments upcoming. Tifa and Cloud have the live stream sequence, which I am seriously looking forward to. There are all sorts of other moments with different characters. Vincent's story still is yet to be told, Cid's flashback at Rocket Town and Shara, and many more. As a result, I do believe that if we do see DLC for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, it would either focus on stuff that they would like to show in Part 3 but don't have the time to, or storylines that would focus too intensely on one character and detract from the overall narrative. If you think about Yuffie's episode, Intermission, that really wouldn't work in the main story of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Just thinking about it for a second, if the team opted to insert Yuffie's entire episode or parts of it into the story for Remake, it would have detracted from the narrative and broken up the pacing. There wasn't any issues or challenges with this in Rebirth, and there certainly won't be in Part 3 as well. So again, we need to focus on different candidates that have stories to be told that might detract from the narrative. So, I've picked 3 different characters that I believe could possibly receive DLC if it were to be made for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. One of these in particular seems like the overwhelmingly best choice, but the other 2 are worth mentioning and they're fun to talk about, so why not? With that being said, let's dive into our first DLC possibility, Vincent Valentine. In my opinion, this is the obvious choice. DLC focused on Vincent Valentine would be perfect because in the main game of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Vincent was really only there for the last few hours of the game. As you may know, he was the last party member that the party encountered, finding him deep in slumber in the Shinra Manor in Nibelheim. In the original Final Fantasy VII, Vincent Valentine was simply an optional party member who had a little bit of story here and there at certain moments. But now, just like Yuffie, he's a mandatory party member and he has a story to be told. If we look at the compilation of Final Fantasy VII as a whole and not just the original game, I would argue that Vincent is one of the most fleshed out party members, particularly because he essentially got his own game in Dirge of Cerberus. Now, we're still hoping to see this get a remaster, but chances are it won't happen until after Part 3 if it does. We've already made a video discussing the remaster possibilities, and it's worth noting that again, Nomura basically said in an interview, if we were to remake or remaster Dirge, it spoils the rest of the story for players. Considering that this game covers a lot of ground, especially with Vincent's backstory, it's safe to say that we should not expect all of this to make it into base game Part 3. So, what elements of Dirge could be used if the remake team were to make DLC for Rebirth? In my opinion, I believe you tackle the flashback we see in the game with Vincent as a Turk and really flesh that out and make it playable. Years before Final Fantasy VII begins, Vincent was just a member of the Turks. He was assigned to the Genova project where he met and fell in love with Lucrezia. Many events unfold, with Lucrezia learning that Vincent was the son of Grimoire Valentine, a scientist she formerly worked for, and one who saved her life. Vincent also discovers this, and a conversation about it with Lucrezia draws a wedge between them, ultimately putting the events of Final Fantasy VII into motion. Lucrezia worked with Professor Hojo, and the two became pregnant, with Hojo wishing to subject the child to experiments related to the Genova project. Hojo then implanted the embryo with Genova cells, which caused Lucrezia as its carrier lots of pain and all sorts of different side effects. Vincent attempted to stop Hojo after Lucrezia underwent this experiment, but Hojo shot him, leading Hojo to experiment on Vincent and then throwing away his body after deeming it a failure. This leads Lucrezia to inject chaos energy into Vincent, allowing him to revive since he was strong enough to house chaos due to the experiments. This wasn't enough though, leaving Vincent unable to control it, so she placed the proto-materia inside Vincent, which allowed him to control chaos. That's a very summarized piece of information and quite a bit of it, but hopefully you could see how this could possibly be a DLC episode. Vincent's duties as a Turk could be vastly expanded, offering insight into the organization that we do not get to see as members of Avalanche. This DLC could lead into Lucrezia Cave, where we find her inside the crystal in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. More pieces of Dirge could be adapted or even something entirely new, which is likely even if they choose the flashback route, but this segment of Vincent's story seems to be the most primed for expansion. As I stated, Vincent's story in Part 3 will definitely lead us to Lucrezia Cave. This is going to be a major part of the narrative. There will of course be some build up to this throughout the story, as I mentioned possibly at Icicle Inn, but really it's up to the development team on just how extensive this segment will be. Will we get to see extensive details of what happened with Vincent and Lucrezia, or will it just be, a 5 to 10 minute cutscene? This is of course entirely up to the development team to determine how they will lead this narrative. But if I were a betting man, I'd say Vincent gets a good chunk of a chapter or a full chapter at bare minimum. All of the other party members have had 2 full games to really build on their characters, and Vincent and Sid especially are gonna need that development in Part 3. So, to summarize, yes, this segment should be in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. However, if Tetsuya Nomura, Kazushige Nojima, Yoshinori Kitase, or Naoki Hamaguchi want to expand his past and really flesh it out, DLC could be the answer. Again, I'd argue that Vincent makes the most sense out of any character for Rebirth DLC, mainly due to the fact that he has a game where he was the protagonist that's yet to be adapted. Sure, we've seen some elements of Dirge like the Deep Ground members in Intermission, but this would be the perfect opportunity to inject more of the compilation into the remake trilogy without sacrificing the pacing of the narrative. Alright, now we're gonna get to the more obscure picks, but these are a lot of fun in my opinion. So secondly, for DLC, I'd be interested to see the remake team take on a Cait Sith DLC. Now once again, I chose Cait Sith because I think obviously he's a very interesting background, one that also really wasn't explored that much in the base game. You might not know this, but Cait Sith, or Cat Shi depending on who you ask, actually appeared in Before Crisis. Before Crisis is something that we've seen bits and pieces of in the remake continuity, but the team has really yet to pull a ton from it. There was actually a bonus weapon of the planet in Before Crisis that was defeated, and even Cissnei made her debut in Before Crisis. As for Cait Sith, we actually see Reeve make the first prototype in this game. It almost makes me wonder if the remake development team could perhaps make a DLC for Rebirth focused on Cait Sith and this unexplored lore. We could dive into how Reeve first made Cait Sith as a prototype and even his journey through Shinra. The journey of Cait Sith from Before Crisis up to the plate falling in Remake is also something that just hasn't been explored yet, and that would make a really interesting and fun DLC. Let's just hope we don't have to throw any more boxes. And finally, the last character that I think we can consider for DLC is none other than Cid Highwind. Now, I know what you're thinking, and I think the same thing. There's no way this happens, and I 100% agree with you. However, it's going to be interesting to see how they tackle his character. There's a lot of questions around Sid right now, especially how almost friendly he seemed with Shinra, which is a big departure from how he was in the original Final Fantasy VII. The jury's still out on Sid, and I think again, this is something that will undoubtedly be explored in Part 3, but if the development team wanted to either expand on his character or flesh out something that wasn't possible in Part 3, DLC would be the time to do that. Wrapping things up, this DLC is really fun to talk about, and more Final Fantasy VII content is almost like a dream, right? But at the same time, I can't help but feel that DLC is ultimately unnecessary for Rebirth. The game covered so many locations and so much content, and if you look at Part 3, it's almost mind-boggling to think what's left. We have the entirety of Disc 2 to get through, which will undoubtedly be 40 to 50 hours by itself. I think between the locations left, the remake team will incorporate some new storylines alongside some from the compilation and of course the original game, and give us an experience that covers every character in a great way. Vincent, Sid, and Kate Sith will all get their time to shine, so I'm not worried about that at all. While I'm personally closing the book for new story content for Rebirth, my attention hasn't strayed from Part 3 and what potential content could lie after that. I've got plenty to talk about here, whether Advent Children needs its own story DLC or even game, and we'll have a lot more on that in the coming months. However, right now, our full attention is on the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth PC release. As director Naoki Hamaguchi said, if you want story DLC, let your demands be heard. Therefore, support the game on PC and let the developers know you'd like more, and hey, who knows what's possible. Thank you so much for checking out episode 13 of Under the Plate here at Final Weapon. I hope you're having a great start to your 2025, and I hope you're excited for more Under the Plate content this year. We've got all sorts of things planned, and they're coming up quick. 2025 is going to be a wonderful year for Final Fantasy VII, with new Ever Crisis content, Rebirth on PC, and potentially even the reveal of Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. If you don't want to miss any of it, be sure to hit the subscribe button below, and let us know what other content you'd like to see with Under the Plate as we await what lies ahead in the unknown journey. We'll catch you next time.